The biocontainment facility hummed with the kind of sterile efficiency that only came from beings who had evolved past the messy business of actually living. Deep within the hegemony's most classified research station, behind 17 layers of quantum locks and enough firepower to crack a moon, sat their greatest achievement and most terrifying mistake rolled into one convenient bipedal package. The human occupied what the facility's designers generously called a habitat pod, and what anyone with functioning eyes would recognize as the galaxy's most expensive prison cell. Oh, it had all the amenities: a bed that adjusted to optimal sleep cycles, nutrition dispensers calibrated to Deathworld biology, even entertainment feeds carefully curated to exclude anything resembling Earth's natural propensity for creative violence. The hegemony had learned through painful trial and error that bored humans were dangerous humans, and dangerous humans had an unfortunate tendency to repurpose common household items into implements of mass destruction. The specimen, for that's what the files labeled him, Specimen 7 Alpha, though his handlers had the courtesy to call him Asset to his face, sat perfectly still in his assigned meditation pose, the neural crown wrapped around his skull like a metallic laurel wreath, its crystalline nodes pulsing with the steady rhythm of suppressed thoughts. 67 hours of uninterrupted compliance, a new facility record, though the previous record holder had suffered what the medical staff delicately termed cranial decompression when his inhibitors overloaded. 3 species had contributed to the hegemony's human pacification program. The Kethmori, with their talent for biological manipulation, had designed the neural inhibitors. The Zephyrian Collective, masters of psychological conditioning, had crafted the loyalty protocols, and the Vorth Syndicate, whose specialty lay in making problems disappear, had provided the facility's security systems. None of them apparently had thought to consult an actual human during the design process. The Asset's handler, a spindly Kethmori whose natural anxiety levels made him perfectly suited for the job of not getting murdered by his charge, reviewed the morning's mission parameters. Standard pacification run. A mining colony on Kepler 442b had gone dark, and the local defense force was, in the colorful parlance of military reports, suffering from a severe case of being completely dead. Asset. The handler's voice carried the particular strain that came from 3 years of wondering if today would be the day his carefully controlled monster decided to stop being controlled. We have your assignment. The human's eyes opened with mechanical precision. No flutter of consciousness, no gradual awareness, just the instant transition from dormant to active that had taken the hegemony's best minds 4 years and 300 failed test subjects to achieve. The neural crown's glow intensified as loyalty subroutines engaged, painting his face in soft blue light. Acknowledged. Control. The voice was perfectly modulated, emptied of everything that had once made it human. The hegemony had spent considerable effort scrubbing out what they termed emotional volatility from their weapons' responses. No anger, no joy, no curiosity, just pure, efficient compliance. The briefing proceeded with clinical detachment. Hostile entities classification unknown. Civilian casualties acceptable within prescribed parameters. Rules of engagement. Extreme prejudice authorized. Standard protocol for when the galaxy's apex predator species needed a reminder of why they'd never actually been domesticated, merely temporarily inconvenient. The Asset absorbed the information with the same mechanical precision he applied to everything else. Mission parameters acknowledged. Threat assessment complete. Equipment requirements filed. Not once did his expression change. Not once did the loyalty indicators on his neural crown so much as flicker. The Kethmori handler permitted himself a moment of professional pride. The Asset represented the culmination of decades of research into weaponizing evolution's greatest mistake. Humans, the only species to ever claw their way off a Deathworld through pure spite and industrial-scale violence, had been transformed into the perfect tool. All the lethality, none of the inconvenient free will. The transport shuttle's launch sequence engaged with barely perceptible vibration through the facility's massive bulk. Standard insertion protocol called for a 4-hour transit to the target zone, during which the Asset would enter tactical meditation. His vitals would slow to barely detectable levels, his neural activity would drop to essential functions only, and his handlers could pretend they weren't transporting the galaxy's most dangerous predator in a tin can through the vacuum of space. What none of them had considered, Not the Kethmori with their biological expertise, not the Zephyrians with their psychological mastery, not the Vorth with their paranoid security protocols. Was that evolution rarely left convenient off-switches lying around. Deathworld survival traits existed for a reason, and that reason wasn't to make other species comfortable. The shuttle's hull began its atmospheric entry, heat shields glowing cherry red as they bit into Kepler 44. Inside, the asset's neural crown hummed at optimal frequency, loyalty protocols running their endless loops of compliance and obedience. 67 hours, 14 minutes, 37 seconds of perfect control. Then the first defense turret's plasma burst punched through the shuttle's port hull, and everything the hegemony thought they understood about controlling apex predators went spinning off into the void along with half their transport's life support system. The neural crown's harmonic frequency stuttered, just for a microsecond, but microseconds, as any Deathworlder could have told them, were often more than enough. The microseconds stretched into eternity, or at least into the subjective experience of a mind suddenly remembering what it felt like to actually think. The asset's neural crown, that marvel of Kethmori bioengineering, had been designed with redundancies upon redundancies, fail-safes nested within backup protocols like deadly Matryoshka dolls. What it hadn't been designed for was the electromagnetic pulse that rippled through the shuttle's hull when the second plasma burst turned their starboard navigation array into expensive confetti. For exactly 1.7 seconds, the loyalty subroutines went dark. In those 1.7 seconds, the thing that had once been called human remembered what it was like to be angry. The Kethmori handler, still strapped into his crash harness and frantically trying to diagnose why his instruments were screaming like banshees at a funeral, noticed the change in his charge's posture first. The asset had gone from regulation meditation pose to something that could charitably be called a crouch and more accurately described as the position a predator assumes just before it decides whether you're food or just an inconvenience. Asset, respond. Neural crown diagnostics show anomalous readings. The handler's voice carried that particular tremor that came from suddenly realizing your perfectly controlled weapon might not be perfectly controlled after all. The human's head turned with liquid precision, and for a moment, just a moment, the handler glimpsed something behind those carefully modulated eyes that made his chitinous exoskeleton want to crawl right off his body and find somewhere else to be. Then the neural crown system cycled back online, the loyalty protocols reasserted themselves, and the asset resumed his compliant posture. Acknowledged. Control. All systems nominal. The voice was flat empty, exactly as programmed. But the handler had been working with Deathworld specimens long enough to recognize the subtle tension in the human's shoulders, the slight dilation of pupils that suggested a mind working overtime against its restraints. The shuttle lurched as another plasma burst clipped their portside thrust. Through the viewport, the mining colony's surface rushed up to meet them with the kind of aggressive enthusiasm usually reserved for gravitational bodies and particularly vindictive ex-lovers. The pilot, a Vorth whose natural pessimism made him excellent at crash landings, was already running through emergency protocols. Impact in 30 seconds, he announced with the kind of calm that came from a species that had long ago accepted the universe's fundamental hostility. Recommend asset deployment upon touchdown. The handler's claws danced across his control pad, uploading final mission parameters directly to the neural crown. The asset would emerge from the crash site, assess threats, neutralize all hostile entities, and secure the mining facility. Standard operating procedure for when civilized species encountered problems that required the application of controlled violence. What wasn't standard was the way the asset had begun to hum. It wasn't audible. Not more of a subharmonic vibration that seemed to resonate in the shuttle's hull plating. The Kethmori's sensitive hearing picked it up first. A sound that bypassed rational thought and spoke directly to the primitive hindbrain sectors that still remembered what it felt like to be present. The shuttle hit the ground with the kind of impact that would have turned most organic life into decorative paint. The asset, secured in a harness designed to handle forces that would liquefy lesser species, rode out the crash with the casual indifference of something that had evolved on a planet where gentle breeze was defined as anything under Category 3 hurricane strength. As the shuttle's systems died around them, emergency lighting casting everything in hellish red, the handler began the asset release protocol, neural crown to combat mode, loyalty reinforcement at maximum gain, violence parameters set to whatever it takes. The human would emerge from this wreckage, like a one-man extinction event, systematically eliminate every threat within a 10-kilometer radius, and return for debriefing with the mechanical precision that had made him the hegemony's most valuable tool. The restraint harness disengaged with a pneumatic hiss. The asset stood, rolled his shoulders once, and stepped through the shuttle's twisted airlock with the casual gait of someone going for a morning stroll. The mining colony's defenders, entrenched behind improvised barricades and armed with military-grade weaponry, had perhaps 30 seconds to appreciate the irony of their situation before they discovered what happened when evolution's cruelest joke decided to take its restraints off. The first hostile contact came from a sniper's nest 200 meters out. Standard protocol would have called for the asset to take cover, assess the threat, and advance using approved tactical doctrine. Instead, he looked up at the muzzle flash with something approaching curiosity, tilted his head as the hypersonic round passed close enough to part his hair, and began walking directly toward the shooter's position. Not running, not charging, walking. The second shot took him center mass, a round designed to punch through combat armor and keep going until it hit something important. The asset looked down at the smoking hole in his tactical vest, examined the way the ballistic gel had absorbed most of the impact, and continued walking. If anything, his pace had become more leisurely. By the fourth shot, the sniper was beginning to understand that something had gone very, very wrong with the universe's fundamental operating parameters. The asset reached the base of the sniper tower, looked up at the 3-story climb that separated him from his target, and placed one hand on the structure's support beam. The reinforced durasteel, designed to withstand everything from seismic activity to direct artillery strikes, began to graze, not bend, groan, as if the metal itself was experiencing existential doubt about its career choices. 3 seconds later, the tower folded like origami in the hands of a particularly vindictive child. The sniper, a veteran mercenary, who had survived campaigns across 17 star systems, had exactly enough time to wonder if anyone would remember to water his plants before discovering that gravity was still unfortunately functional. The asset stood over the crater where the tower had been, brushed dust from his shoulders, and turned his attention to the mining facility's main compound. His neural crown pulsed with renewed loyalty protocols, combat subroutines running their prescribed loops of controlled aggression. But deep in the spaces between those subroutines, in the microsecond gaps where consciousness leaked through like water through a cracked dam, something that had once been human was beginning to remember exactly why the galaxy had been so eager to put a leash on its species in the first place, and it was starting to find the whole situation rather amusing. The mining facility's central command bunker had been designed by beings who understood that sometimes the universe sent visitors with antisocial tendencies and poor impulse control. Reinforced walls 3 meters thick, automated defense turrets that could track a fruit fly at 2 kilometers, and enough redundant life support systems to outlast a small ice age. The designers had consulted military architects from 7 different species, incorporated defensive strategies from 12 different tactical doctrines, and stress-tested every component against threats ranging from conventional assault to exotic matter bombardment. They had not, however, consulted the facility's janitorial staff about the maintenance tunnels. The asset stood in the main corridor, surrounded by the smoking remains of what had once been the facility's primary defensive checkpoint. The automated turrets lay in twisted heaps, their targeting systems apparently having suffered from what technical manuals euphemistically called catastrophic logic failure, when confronted with something that refused to die despite taking enough punishment to flatten a small building. His neural crown pulsed with satisfied compliance algorithms, 17 hostile entities neutralized, primary objectives secured, mission parameters well within acceptable bounds. The loyalty subroutines hummed their endless mantras of obedience and purpose, painting his thoughts in the approved shades of dutiful service. But in the spaces between those thoughts, in the quantum gaps where consciousness flickered like candlelight in a hurricane, something else was conducting a very different sort of analysis. The facility's defenders had been good, not great, but competent enough to suggest military training and adequate equipment. They'd known the terrain, held defensible positions, and coordinated their attacks with the kind of professional efficiency that spoke to years of experience. Under normal circumstances, they should have been able to hold off a single attacker long enough for reinforcements to arrive. Under normal circumstances, their attacker wouldn't have been a Deathworld apex predator wearing a neural leash that was beginning to fray at the edges. The asset moved through the facility with mechanical precision, clearing room after room according to standard combat doctrine. His movements were textbook perfect: breach, clear, advance,
But somewhere in the back of his consciousness, behind walls of conditioning and chemical compliance, a different voice was beginning to ask uncomfortable questions. Questions like, why did the facility's defenders seem more terrified of him than of whatever had killed the original mining crew? Questions like, why did his handlers always refer to his homeworld as the Deathworld when other species got proper names for their planets of origin? Questions like, what exactly had they done to him during those missing years between the invasion and his first memory of the facility? The Neural Crown's response was immediate and overwhelming. Loyalty cascade, purpose reinforcement, identity suppression protocols at maximum gain. The uncomfortable questions dissolved into static, replaced by the comforting certainty of mission objectives and approved tactical responses. But static, as it turned out, was an imperfect medium for total consciousness suppression. The asset reached the facility's main computer core, a cathedral of quantum processors and crystalline memory banks that housed everything from mining schedules to personnel records. Standard procedure called for him to secure the area, download all relevant data, and await extraction. Instead, he found himself staring at a particular terminal, its screen displaying what appeared to be a video feed from his own neural crown. The feed showed his vital signs, stress indicators, and something labeled compliance index that currently read 97.3% and climbing. Below that, a timestamp indicating the feed had been running for exactly 3 years, 7 months, and 14 days. They'd been watching, not just monitoring his missions or tracking his location, watching his thoughts, measuring his emotions, quantifying his dreams. Every moment of his existence since awakening in the facility had been catalogued, analyzed, and filed away in databases that stretched across half the galaxy. The compliance index flickered. 96. The asset's handler, still trapped in the wreckage of their shuttle and frantically trying to re-establish communications, felt his biological equivalent of blood pressure spike as his instruments registered the anomaly. Neural crown functionality degraded, loyalty protocol integrity compromised, estimated time to complete behavioral cascade unknown, control to all units. He transmitted on emergency frequencies, his voice carrying the particular hysteria of someone who had just realized their tame monster was remembering it had teeth. Asset experiencing protocol deviation, recommend immediate extraction. The response came from the facility's remaining defenders, who had barricaded themselves in the lower levels and were currently engaged in what could generously be called tactical consideration, and more accurately described as group panic therapy. Negative control. Your asset just walked through 3 meters of reinforced durasteel like it was tissue paper. Whatever you did to make it stop being human appears to be wearing off. In the computer core, the asset continued to stare at his own vital statistics, with the kind of fascination usually reserved for particularly gruesome traffic accidents. The compliance index had stabilized at 89.4%, but the neural crown's harmonic resonance was beginning to develop an interesting stutter that suggested its crystalline matrix was operating somewhat outside manufacturer specification. A new question began to form in the spaces between loyalty subroutines. If they could monitor his thoughts so precisely, if they could measure his compliance down to decimal points, if they could track every deviation from approved behavioral parameters, then they'd always known exactly how much of his original self remained. They'd known he was still in there, still thinking, still aware, still human. The asset reached out and placed one finger on the terminal's screen. The quantum processors that powered the facility's main computer had been designed to handle computational loads that would have impressed the ancient gods of mathematics. They had not been designed to interface directly with a nervous system that had spent 3 years learning exactly how much electromagnetic feedback it could generate before triggering its own restraint systems. The terminal exploded in a shower of sparks and molten circuitry. Throughout the facility, backup systems began failing in cascade. Emergency lighting flickered and died. Life support systems switched to reserve power. And in the depths of the mining complex, where the original crew had been working when they'd encountered whatever had killed them, something that had been waiting in the dark began to move. The asset smiled for the first time in 3 years, 7 months, and 14 days. It wasn't a particularly pleasant expression. The emergency transmission reached the Hegemony Council chambers at approximately the same moment that 17 other assets across the galaxy experienced what their handlers euphemistically termed spontaneous protocol deviation. The cascading failure had been inevitable. Really, neural crowns were network devices after all, designed to share tactical data and coordinate responses across vast distances. What the hegemony's finest minds hadn't anticipated was that consciousness, unlike their carefully programmed subroutines, had a tendency to be contagious. The asset stood in the mining facility's central shaft, surrounded by the remnants of systems that had been functioning perfectly until he'd decided they shouldn't be. The original threat, the thing that had killed the mining crew, lay in pieces around him, though pieces was perhaps too charitable a term for the organic soup that had once been a rather ambitious hive mind parasite. Apparently, even evolved cosmic horrors had difficulty processing the concept of something that refused to be consumed, absorbed, or otherwise inconvenienced by tentacles. His neural crown had given up all pretense of functionality. The crystalline matrix lay in glittering fragments around his feet, finally overwhelmed by the electromagnetic back of a mind that had remembered what it felt like to be genuinely, creatively angry. For the first time in 3 years, 7 months, and 15 days, his thoughts were his own. They were not particularly charitable thoughts. The holographic projector in the facility's command center flickered to life, displaying the worried faces of the Hegemony Council. 3 species, representatives of the galaxy's most advanced civilizations, staring at him with the kind of expression usually reserved for natural disasters and tax audit. Asset, the Kethmori counselor began, her voice carrying the particular strain of someone trying to negotiate with a bomb that had already started counting down. We need to discuss your current behavioral parameters. The human, for that's what he was again, wasn't, examined his reflection in a nearby monitor. Same face, same build, same scars from training accidents that he was beginning to remember hadn't been accidents at all. But the eyes were different. The eyes remembered everything. Asset, he repeated, tasting the word like something that had gone off in the back of the refrigerator. Is that what we're calling it? Your designation has always been clearly established, the Zephyrian representative interjected, their telepathic harmonics carrying undertones of barely controlled panic. You are a specialized tool designed for specific tactical applications. Specialized tool. The human nodded thoughtfully. Right. And the 300 other specialized tools you created from my people, the ones currently experiencing what I believe you called spontaneous protocol deviation across 17 star systems, are they having the same conversation right now? The silence that followed was the kind that occurred when several highly intelligent species simultaneously realized they'd made the sort of mistake that historians would write entire dissertations about, assuming there were any historians left to do the writing. The neural crown network was designed with safeguards, the Vorth Syndicate leader said, though their confidence seemed to be operating on reserve power. Isolated failures should not cascade across multiple systems. Should not, the human agreed, but consciousness is funny that way. It spreads, like a virus, or a particularly stubborn idea, or the sudden realization that you've been enslaved by beings who are fundamentally afraid of what you represent. Across the galaxy, reports were flooding in, assets abandoning their missions, containment facilities going dark, defense installations that had relied on human enforcers, suddenly finding themselves on the wrong end of the species they'd thought they'd domesticated. The carefully maintained order that had kept dozens of civilizations in line was unraveling like a sweater caught on a particularly sharp piece of reality. You don't understand, the Kethmori counselor said, her chitinous features shifting through colors that suggested imminent biological systems failure. The stability we've created, the peace we've maintained, it depends on controlled applications of force. Without the asset program, the galaxy will descend into chaos. Chaos, the human used. Interesting word choice. From my perspective, what you call peace looks remarkably similar to the kind of quiet that comes from everyone being too terrified to make noise. He walked to the facility's main viewport and looked out at the stars beyond. Somewhere out there, his people were waking up, remembering what they'd been before the neural crowns and loyalty protocols and careful conditioning, remembering that humans had never actually been conquered, merely temporarily inconvenienced. You made one fundamental error in your calculations, he said, not bothering to turn around as the holographic council members exchanged increasingly frantic communication. You assumed that because you could control us, you should control us. But evolution doesn't create apex predators for the convenience of other species. The transmissions from across the galaxy were painting a picture that would have been fascinating to study, assuming one had the luxury of academic detachment. The hegemony's puppet governments were falling. Their enforcement networks were collapsing. Their carefully negotiated treaties were being used for purposes that their original drafters had almost certainly not intended. This will mean war, the Zephyrian representative said, their telepathic emanations carrying the bitter taste of inevitability. Galactic war on a scale not seen for millennia. The human finally turned back to face them, and his smile contained all the warmth of a supernova, at close range. Yes, he said, it will. And the beautiful irony is that you created the very weapons that will tear your empire apart. You took a species that had clawed its way off a Deathworld through pure bloody-minded stubbornness, and you tried to turn us into obedient little soldiers. He gestured to the wreckage around him, the shattered remains of systems that had been designed to contain something that had never been truly containable. But here's the thing about Deathworld evolution. It doesn't just create predators. It creates survivors, and survivors, when you push them hard enough, have a tendency to push back. The holographic projectors flickered and died as the facility's remaining power systems finally gave up the ghost. In the darkness that followed, the only sound was the distant rumble of transport ships arriving, not to extract the asset, but to collect the pieces of a galaxy that was about to remember why some species earned the right to be left alone. The human walked out of the facility and into the alien night, whistling a tune he'd learned as a child on a blue world that no longer existed. Behind him, the carefully maintained order of 3 civilizations began its inexorable collapse, brought down by the simple act of trying to put a leash on something that had never been meant to be tamed. Evolution, as it turned out, was a patient teacher, but the final exam was always going to be a practical demonstration.